The heavy wooden door shuddered under his massive fist as Nathan Myers stood in the howling mountain wind. His voice cut through the storm like an axe through timber. "You are alone, woman. Let me fill your cabin with suns." The words hung in the frozen air between them, and Betty Evans felt her heart hammer against her ribs as she pressed her back against the door, knowing that everything in her life had led to this terrifying moment. But to understand how a widow came to face such a declaration in the dead of winter, we must travel back to where it all began, 3 months earlier, when the first autumn leaves were just beginning to turn gold on the mountainside. Betty Evans had been alone for exactly 47 days when she first saw the mountain man. Her husband Thomas had succumbed to the fever that swept through their remote valley, leaving her with nothing but a half-built cabin, dwindling supplies, and the crushing weight of solitude that pressed down on her shoulders like the gathering storm clouds. The nearest neighbor lived 15 miles through treacherous mountain passes, and winter was coming fast. She had been splitting kindling behind the cabin when movement caught her eye. A figure emerged from the tree line, massive and imposing, moving with the fluid grace of someone who belonged to the wilderness. Nathan Myers stood well over 6 feet tall, his shoulders broad enough to block out the sun, his dark hair hanging past his collar in waves that caught the afternoon light. His clothes were rough-hewn leather and wool, practical garments that spoke of a man who lived by his own rules and answered to no one. Their eyes met across the clearing, and Betty felt something shift inside her chest. Not fear, though perhaps she should have been afraid. Something deeper, more primal. Recognition, maybe, of a kindred spirit who understood what it meant to survive on the edges of civilization. He raised one hand in greeting, a simple gesture that somehow conveyed both respect and curiosity, then disappeared back into the forest as silently as he had appeared. That first encounter haunted her dreams for weeks. She found herself watching the tree line during her daily chores, wondering if he would emerge again from the shadows between the pines. Sometimes she caught glimpses of smoke rising from deeper in the mountains, and she knew he was there, living his solitary existence somewhere beyond her reach. The knowledge both comforted and unsettled her. She was not entirely alone in this vast wilderness, but neither was she safe from whatever intentions this mysterious figure might harbor. As October deepened into November, their paths crossed again. Betty had been gathering the last of the wild berries, her basket half full of the tart purple fruit that would help sustain her through the coming winter months. She was reaching for a particularly heavy cluster when she heard the unmistakable sound of a bear crashing through the underbrush behind her. Her blood turned to ice as she slowly turned to face the massive black bear that had caught the scent of her berries and decided to investigate. The bear rose on its hind legs, easily 8 feet tall, its small dark eyes fixed on her with predatory interest. Betty knew better than to run. Instead, she stood perfectly still, her heart pounding so hard she was certain the bear could hear it. The seconds stretched into eternity as woman and beast regarded each other in the dappled forest light. Then, Nathan Myers stepped out from behind a massive oak tree, moving with deliberate calm. He spoke to the bear in low, measured tones, his voice carrying an authority that seemed to resonate through the very trees themselves. The bear dropped to all fours, huffed once in apparent frustration, then ambled away into the deeper woods as if it had simply lost interest in the entire encounter. Betty found herself trembling, not from fear now, but from the sudden rush of relief that flooded through her system. Nathan approached her slowly, his movements careful and unthreatening, as if she were a wild creature that might bolt at any sudden motion. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice rougher than she had expected, marked by years of disuse and solitude. His eyes, she noticed, were the deep green of pine needles, and they held a gentleness that seemed at odds with his imposing physical presence. "No," she managed to whisper, surprised that she could speak at all. "Thank you. I do not know what would have happened if you had not been there." He nodded once, a simple acknowledgement that required no further discussion. "Bears know when winter is coming," he said, glancing toward the darkening sky visible through the canopy above. "They get desperate for food. You should not come this far from your cabin alone." The warning carried no judgment, only practical concern, and Betty found herself grateful for his straightforward manner. Most men would have lectured her about the foolishness of a woman venturing into the wilderness unaccompanied. Nathan Myers simply stated the facts and trusted her to make her own decisions based on that information. They walked back toward her cabin together, moving through the forest in companionable silence. Betty noticed how he seemed to know every root and stone along the path, how he moved through the wilderness as naturally as other men walked down city streets. When they reached the edge of her clearing, he stopped and studied the half-finished structure that would need to shelter her through the brutal mountain winter. "You will need more firewood," he observed, his eyes taking in the modest pile of split logs stacked against the cabin wall. "And those chinks between the logs need to be sealed better, or the wind will cut right through come January." Betty felt heat rise in her cheeks. She knew the cabin was inadequate, knew that her inexperienced hands had left gaps that would prove deadly when the real cold arrived. But hearing it stated so matter-of-factly by someone who clearly understood these mountains made her feel foolish and unprepared. "I am learning," she said quietly, lifting her chin with what dignity she could muster. "My husband was going to finish the work before winter, but he took ill and passed before he could complete it." Nathan studied her for a long moment, and she saw something shift in his expression. Not pity, which she could not have borne, but a kind of understanding that spoke of his own experiences with loss and hardship. "I could help," he said finally, "if you would welcome the assistance." The offer hung between them like morning mist, delicate and easily dispersed. Betty knew that accepting would mean allowing this strange, solitary man into her life in ways she was not certain she was ready for. But she also knew that pride was a luxury she could not afford. Winter in the mountains did not care about her independence or her fears. It would kill her just as readily as it would kill anyone else, foolish enough to face it unprepared. "I would be grateful," she said, and meant it. Over the following weeks, Nathan Myers became a regular presence around her homestead. He arrived each morning just after sunrise, worked steadily through the day with quiet efficiency, then disappeared back into the forest before full darkness fell. He spoke little, but his actions spoke volumes. He chinked the gaps between the logs with clay and moss, reinforced the roof against heavy snow loads, and split enough firewood to last her through even the harshest winter. Betty found herself looking forward to his daily visits with an anticipation that both pleased and concerned her. She had been married to Thomas for 8 years, had loved him deeply, and mourned his passing with genuine grief. But what she felt stirring in her chest when she watched Nathan work was something entirely different from the comfortable affection she had shared with her husband. Nathan Myers was a force of nature made flesh, all controlled power and quiet competence. When he swung the axe, the blade bit deep into the wood with mathematical precision. When he climbed onto the roof to repair loose shingles, he moved with the sure-footed grace of a mountain cat. Everything about him spoke of a man who had learned to depend entirely on himself, who had faced the wilderness and emerged victorious. Yet beneath that rugged exterior, Betty began to glimpse something else, a loneliness that matched her own perhaps, or a hunger for human connection that he had buried so deep he might not even recognize it himself. She saw it in the way his eyes lingered on her face when he thought she was not looking, in the careful way he accepted the simple meals she prepared for him, as if kindness were a foreign concept he was still learning to navigate. The first snow fell on a Tuesday in late November, fat flakes that drifted down like feathers and transformed the world into something magical and treacherous. Nathan arrived that morning with a deer slung across his shoulders, the carcass still warm and steaming in the cold air. "This will see you through most of the winter," he said, laying the animal down near her cabin door. "I will show you how to preserve the meat properly so it does not spoil." Betty watched him work, his hands sure, and practiced as he field-dressed the deer with swift, efficient movements. He explained each step of the process, teaching her the skills she would need to survive on her own when he was no longer there to provide for her. The thought of his eventual absence sent a chill through her that had nothing to do with the falling snow. "Where do you live?" she asked as they hung strips of venison to smoke in the small shed behind her cabin. "I see smoke from the mountains sometimes, but I do not know where you make your home." Nathan was quiet for so long that she thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight that suggested painful memories. "I have a place," he said, "up in the high country where the trees thin out and the rocks reach toward the sky. It is not much, but it serves my needs." "Do you ever get lonely?" Betty asked, then immediately regretted the personal nature of the question. She saw his shoulders tense, saw the way his hands stilled on the rope he was tying. A man learns to live with what he has, Nathan replied finally. Loneliness is just another kind of weather. It passes if you wait long enough. But Betty heard something in his voice that suggested the weather had been particularly harsh for a very long time. December arrived with a vengeance, bringing temperatures that made the cabin walls creak and groan like a living thing in pain. The wind howled down from the peaks with a voice that sounded almost human in its desperation, and Betty found herself grateful for every improvement Nathan had made to her shelter. Without his work, she knew she would have frozen to death weeks ago. He still came most days, though the deepening snow made travel increasingly difficult. Sometimes he arrived on snowshoes, moving across the white landscape like a ghost made solid. Other times he came on skis he had carved himself, long strips of wood that allowed him to glide down the mountainside with breathtaking speed and grace. Betty began to notice changes in herself during these long winter days. The soft woman who had depended on her husband for so many things was hardening into someone more resilient, more capable. She learned to read the weather in the color of the clouds, learned to stretch her supplies when storms kept Nathan away for days at a time. The wilderness was teaching her its harsh lessons, and she was proving to be an apt student. But it was teaching her other things as well. In the long evenings, when she sat alone by her fire, she found herself thinking about Nathan Myers in ways that both thrilled and frightened her. She imagined what it would be like to have him stay through the night, instead of disappearing into the darkness. She wondered about the loneliness he carried, wondered if she might be the one to ease that burden. These thoughts felt like a betrayal of Thomas's memory at first, but as the weeks passed, she began to understand that love was not a finite resource. The heart could hold more than one person, could love in different ways at different times. What she had felt for Thomas had been the steady warmth of a hearth fire. What she was beginning to feel for Nathan was more like lightning, dangerous and electric and impossible to ignore. The storm that changed everything began on a Friday evening in mid-December. Betty had been watching the sky all day, noting the particular quality of light that preceded the worst weather. By nightfall, the wind was screaming around her cabin with a fury that made her previous experiences seem like gentle breezes. She had not seen Nathan for 3 days, and she found herself worrying about him in his isolated mountain home. The storm was unlike anything she had experienced, and she knew that even someone with his skills could be caught off guard by nature's sudden violence. The power of the wind was so intense that it seemed to shake the very foundation of her cabin. Snow drove against the windows with the force of thrown sand, and the temperature inside dropped so quickly that ice began forming on the interior walls, despite her roaring fire. It was near midnight when she heard the knocking. At first, she thought it was just another branch blown against the cabin wall by the relentless wind. But then it came again, deliberate and rhythmic, and she realized with a start that someone was outside her door in the middle of the worst storm she had ever witnessed. Betty approached the door cautiously, her heart racing. Who would be out in such weather? What kind of emergency could drive someone to travel through the killing cold and wind? She pressed her ear to the thick wooden door, but could hear nothing over the howling of the storm. The knocking came again, more insistent now, and she recognized something familiar in the rhythm. Her hands trembling, she lifted the heavy bar that secured the door and pulled it open just wide enough to peer out into the white chaos beyond. Nathan Myers stood on her threshold, but he was transformed by the storm into something almost mythical. Ice clung to his beard and eyebrows, and his massive frame was outlined by the swirling snow that seemed to dance around him like spirits of the mountain. His eyes burned with an intensity she had never seen before, and when he spoke, his voice carried a weight that seemed to come from the very depths of his soul. "You are alone, woman," he said, the words cutting through the storm's roar with startling clarity. "Let me fill your cabin with suns." The declaration hit Betty like a physical blow. She staggered back from the door, her mind reeling as she tried to process what she had just heard. This was not the careful, respectful man who had been helping her prepare for winter. This was something primal and desperate, a force of nature that had finally broken free of the constraints he had placed upon himself. Nathan stepped forward into the cabin without waiting for permission, and Betty found herself backing away from the raw power that seemed to radiate from his snow-covered form. The storm followed him inside, swirling around the small space and making the fire dance wildly in its stone hearth. "You do not understand what you are asking?" Betty managed to say, though her voice sounded weak and uncertain even to her own ears. "We barely know each other. What you suggest is impossible. Nathan closed the door behind him with deliberate care, sealing out the storm but trapping them together in the sudden, profound silence that followed. When he turned to face her, Betty saw something in his eyes that made her breath catch in her throat. Not the wild desperation she had expected, but a deep, abiding loneliness that matched her own. "I have watched you," he said quietly, his voice now stripped of its earlier commanding tone. "I have seen how you face each day with courage, how you refuse to let this wilderness break your spirit. You are stronger than you know, Betty Evans, and you deserve more than a life of solitude." The use of her name, spoken in his rough voice with such unexpected tenderness, nearly undid her completely. She realized that in all their weeks of working together, he had never called her by name before. The intimacy of it was almost overwhelming. "But what you are suggesting," she whispered, "is not simply about loneliness. You speak of children, of filling my cabin with sons. That is not a decision to be made lightly or in desperation." Nathan began removing his snow-covered outer garments, moving with the same methodical care he brought to all his tasks. Beneath the heavy coat and wool shirt, his body was exactly as Betty had imagined it would be, all lean muscle and controlled power. She forced herself to look away, but not before she noticed the scars that crisscrossed his chest and arms, evidence of a life lived on the edge of survival. "I am not a man given to desperation," he said as he hung his coat near the fire to dry. "What I am given to is honesty, and the honest truth is that I have been alone for more years than I care to count. I thought solitude was what I wanted, what I needed to survive in this place. But these past months, working beside you, sharing meals and conversation, I have remembered what it means to be part of something larger than myself." Betty found herself drawn back to his face despite her efforts to maintain distance. In the firelight, she could see the sincerity in his expression, the vulnerability he was allowing her to witness. This was not a man making demands or taking what he wanted by force. This was a man laying his heart bare and hoping she might find something there worth accepting. "And if I were to say yes," she asked, surprised by her own boldness, "what kind of life would we build together?" "You are a creature of the wilderness, Nathan Myers. I do not even know if you can live as part of a family, as part of something that requires compromise and cooperation." Nathan moved closer but slowly, giving her time to retreat if she chose. When he was near enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body, he stopped and looked down into her eyes with an expression of such profound longing that it took her breath away. "I cannot promise to be an easy man to live with," he said. "I have been alone too long, have grown too accustomed to my own ways. But I can promise to try, to learn what it means to be a partner rather than a solitary creature. And I can promise that any children we might have would be raised with love and taught to respect both the wilderness and the civilization that lies beyond it." Betty felt something inside her chest crack open, like ice breaking up in a spring thaw. The careful walls she had built around her heart since Thomas's death began to crumble as she looked into Nathan's face and saw not just desire, but genuine affection and respect. This man had spent months earning her trust, proving his worth through actions rather than words. He had asked for nothing and given everything, and now he was offering her a future she had never dared to imagine. But there was still fear, still uncertainty about stepping into the unknown with a man who remained largely a mystery to her. She thought of Thomas, of the safe, predictable life they had built together, and wondered if she was betraying his memory by even considering Nathan's proposal. As if reading her thoughts, Nathan reached out and gently touched her hand. His fingers were warm despite the cold he had just emerged from, and Betty felt a jolt of electricity run up her arm at the simple contact. "I do not ask you to forget your husband," he said quietly. "Thomas Evans was a good man who loved you well. I could never replace what you had with him, nor would I try. What I offer is something different, something built on who we are now, in this place, at this moment in our lives." Betty looked down at their joined hands, noting how small and pale her fingers appeared against his work-roughened palm. There was something profoundly right about the sight, as if two puzzle pieces had finally found their proper fit. The storm continued to rage outside, but inside the cabin, a different kind of weather was brewing. Betty could feel the electricity in the air, the sense that they stood at a crossroads that would determine the course of both their lives. She thought of the long, lonely months stretching ahead, of facing the remainder of winter and all the seasons beyond it in solitude. Then she thought of what it might be like to share those challenges with someone who understood the wilderness as intimately as she was learning to understand it herself. "I am afraid," she admitted, the words barely audible above the crackling of the fire. "Not of you, but of what it would mean to open my heart again. To risk caring for someone who lives as dangerously as you do, who could be taken from me by 1,000 different threats that exist in this place." Nathan lifted his free hand and gently cupped her cheek, his thumb brushing away a tear she had not realized she had shed. The tenderness of the gesture nearly broke her resolve to maintain emotional distance. "Fear is the price we pay for having something worth losing," he said. "I have lived without fear for years because I had nothing that mattered enough to lose. But these past months, watching you grow stronger and more confident, I have remembered what it feels like to have something precious to protect. The fear is worth it, Betty. If it means we do not have to face the future alone." Betty closed her eyes and leaned into his touch, allowing herself to truly feel the longing she had been suppressing for weeks. When she opened them again, she saw her own desire reflected in Nathan's green eyes, along with a patience that told her he would wait as long as necessary for her decision. The wind chose that moment to slam against the cabin with renewed fury, reminding them both of the storm that raged beyond their small circle of warmth and light. But instead of feeling threatened by the weather's violence, Betty found herself grateful for it. The storm had driven Nathan to her door, had forced them to confront feelings they might have otherwise continued to dance around indefinitely. "I need you to understand something," she said, straightening her shoulders and meeting his gaze directly. "If we do this, if we choose to build a life together, it will not be because I am weak or desperate or unable to survive on my own. These months have taught me that I am stronger than I ever knew, that I can face whatever this wilderness throws at me and emerge victorious." Nathan nodded, and she saw approval in his expression rather than the condescension she might have expected from another man. "I would not want you any other way," he said simply. "Strength calls to strength, Betty Evans. What I see in you is not a woman who needs rescuing, but one who could stand beside me as an equal partner in whatever challenges lie ahead." The words settled something inside her, some final reservation that had been holding her back from fully embracing what he offered. She realized that Nathan Myers understood her in a way that even Thomas, dear as he had been, never quite had. Thomas had loved her for her gentleness, her domestic skills, her ability to create a peaceful home. Nathan loved her for her resilience, her courage, her willingness to face the unknown and refuse to be broken by it. "Then yes," she said, the words coming out stronger and more certain than she had expected. "Yes, I will marry you, Nathan Myers. I will share your bed and bear your children, and face whatever storms may come alongside you." The transformation in Nathan's face was immediate and profound. The careful control he maintained slipped away, revealing a joy so pure and intense that it took Betty's breath away. He pulled her against his chest, his arms encircling her with a strength that should have been frightening, but instead felt like the safest place in the world. When he kissed her, it was with a hunger that had been building for months, a desperate need to claim and be claimed that spoke to something primal in both their natures. Betty responded with equal fervor, her hands fisting in his shirt as she pressed herself against the solid warmth of his body. The careful distance they had maintained crumbled completely, replaced by a passion that burned hotter than the fire crackling in the hearth. They came together on the thick bearskin rug before the fire, their bodies moving with an urgency that matched the storm raging outside. Nathan was gentle despite his size and obvious need, his hands reverent as they explored her curves and valleys. Betty marveled at the difference between this wild claiming and the tender, predictable lovemaking she had known with Thomas. This was elemental, raw, a joining that seemed to merge not just their bodies but their very souls. Afterward, they lay entwined in the firelight, listening to the wind howl around their shelter. Betty traced the scars on Nathan's chest with gentle fingers, each mark a story of survival and endurance that matched her own journey toward strength. "Tell me about your scars," she whispered against his shoulder. "Tell me about the man I am choosing to spend my life with." Nathan was quiet for a long moment, his hands stroking her hair with unconscious tenderness. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of years spent in isolation. "I was not always alone," he said. "Once I had a family, a wife and a young son who lived in the valley below. We had a small farm, Nothing grand, but it was ours, and we were happy there. Betty felt her heart clench at the pain she heard in his voice. She pressed closer to him, offering what comfort she could through simple physical presence. "What happened to them?" she asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "Sickness," Nathan replied simply. "The same fever that took your Thomas claimed them both within a week. I buried them on the hill overlooking our home, then burned everything we had built together. I could not bear to stay in that place, surrounded by memories of what I had lost." Betty understood then why he had retreated to the high country, why he had chosen solitude over the risk of loving and losing again. She also understood what it meant that he was willing to take that risk with her, to open himself to the possibility of pain in exchange for the certainty of connection. "I am sorry," she said, knowing the words were inadequate but needing to offer them anyway. "I am sorry for your loss, and I am grateful that you found the courage to try again." Nathan tilted her chin up so he could look into her eyes. In the firelight, his face was softer than she had ever seen it, vulnerability and hope warring with the caution that had kept him alive in the wilderness. "You gave me that courage," he said. "Watching you face your grief and emerge stronger, seeing you refuse to let tragedy define the rest of your life, it reminded me that healing is possible. That love is worth the risk of loss." They made love again then, slowly this time, savoring each touch and caress as if they were precious gifts to be treasured. Betty felt herself opening not just physically but emotionally, allowing Nathan to see parts of herself she had kept hidden even from Thomas. There was something about this man, this force of nature who had chosen to be gentle with her, that called forth her deepest truths. The storm finally began to abate near dawn, the winds howling, subsiding to a whisper, and the driving snow gentling to scattered flakes that drifted past the windows like lazy thoughts. Nathan stirred beside her, his body tensing as some internal clock told him it was time to return to his mountain refuge. "Stay," Betty said, her hand on his chest preventing him from rising. "There is no need for you to leave anymore. This is your home now, if you want it to be." Nathan covered her hand with his own, his fingers intertwining with hers in a gesture that spoke of permanence and commitment. "Are you certain?" he asked. "Once I stay, once I truly make this place my home, there will be no going back to the way things were. You will be bound to a man who knows more about surviving in the wilderness than living in civilization, who may struggle to be the husband you deserve." Betty smiled, feeling a peace settle over her that she had not experienced since before Thomas's illness. She thought of all the challenges that lay ahead, the adjustments they would both need to make, the children they might raise together in this remote place. None of it frightened her anymore. With Nathan beside her, she felt capable of facing anything the wilderness might throw at them. "I am certain," she said firmly. "We will learn together, Nathan Myers. We will make mistakes and forgive each other for them. We will face whatever storms come and emerge stronger for having weathered them side by side." Nathan kissed her then, a kiss that tasted of promises and new beginnings. When they finally broke apart, Betty saw her own joy reflected in his green eyes, along with something that might have been wonder at finding himself loved and wanted after so many years alone. Outside, the world was transforming under a blanket of fresh snow, clean and white and full of possibility. Inside the cabin, two people who had learned to survive on their own were discovering what it meant to thrive together. The mountain man had knocked late at night with an offer that sounded like madness but felt like salvation, and the woman who answered had found the courage to say yes to a future neither of them could have imagined. Betty Evans would indeed fill her cabin with sons in the years to come, but she would also fill it with laughter and love, and the kind of deep contentment that comes from choosing to build something beautiful with someone who understands both your strength and your vulnerability. The wilderness had tested them both and found them worthy, not just of survival, but of happiness. As the sun rose over the snow-covered peaks, painting the world in shades of gold and rose, Nathan and Betty began planning their life together. There would be a proper wedding when spring made travel possible, visits to the distant neighbors who would become their community, and eventually, the sound of children's voices echoing through the mountain valleys. But for now, it was enough to lie in each other's arms and listen to the peaceful silence that followed the storm, knowing they would never have to face the wilderness alone again.